Okay, well, welcome everybody to the fall set of Colloquia series from the Veteran Studies Association. My name is Jim Craig. I'm the president of the Veteran Studies Association, on behalf of the organizers of this group, Corinne is there. She's the major effort. Thank you very much for that. We're glad you're here, either in person or watching later on the videos. Let me just take 1 second to tell you, if you don't know, VSA exists to promote and publish scholarship about critical issues shaping veterans' experiences in any country and any historical era to enhance the public understanding, teaching, service, and advocacy. And that really bodes well for today's, because we're going to talk about a non-American experience and a non-current experience in veterans with Dr. Marie Davies. So I would be remiss without saying in March of 2024, we are having a conference at the University of South Carolina. Please consider coming March 14th and 15th. The title of the conference is Tidal Changes in the Sea of Goodwill. And we have a lot of papers that are already being vetted. It's going to be a great event, and we would love to see you. With that, Corinne, I'm going to pass it to you for introductions and bow back out a little bit. So all yours.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you everybody for joining us today. I'm actually going to introduce our featured speaker here, Murray Davies. We are delighted to have him with us. I'm just going to give you a little bit of background on Murray. He's a former Australian Army officer. He left full-time service in 2002 and since then has worked in a range of Commonwealth government and commercial positions in areas of policy development and organizational change. He has strong academic credentials to support these practical experiences, including a Master's of Theology, a Master of Arts and International Relations, a Master of Defense Studies, and a Bachelor of Arts. He's also a graduate of the Royal Military College Duntroon and Australian Army Command and Staff College. We are delighted to have Murray here from Australia. And so thank you to everybody for being open to a new time for these Colloquia series in order to accommodate our fantastic international speaker. And we are delighted to have him here. And now I am going to turn things over to Murray, who is going to share with us about spiritual wounds and injury today.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, or wherever you are in the world. Thank you very much for being here. Just a quick tech check. Can everyone see a screen that says spiritual wounds and injuries?
Not yet.
Not yet. Well, let's see if we can get that one sorted out first. We go.
It says you've started sharing. I think we're just there. It is just waiting for it to load.
Okay, excellent. All right, well, that's good news. So, look, thank you very much for that, folks. Before I begin, as Corinne said, I'm talking to you from the other side of the world. So at any stage, if I use words or terms that you are unfamiliar with, please let me know. You may not be aware, but you all speak with an accent. Okay, so sometimes things might sound a little bit different, but that's okay. I'm really very grateful for the opportunity to speak to you, although, Corinne, I must just correct one aspect of your introduction. Not Dr. Murray Davies yet. Dr. Murray Davies hopefully will be in June of next year when they accept his PhD dissertation. So we are still through the long and somewhat glacial process of writing up the PhD dissertation. So I hope what I'm saying still has some value, but we might just park the doctor thing for just a little bit longer, okay?
Done.
Before I begin today, I just want to give you a little bit of background of where this starts out. Now, obviously, two different nations, and although we fought in the same conflicts and we obviously work closely together, we have a lot of differences, and one of which is our spiritual heritage and our spiritual approach. Australians by nature are somewhat irreligious in some respects. And in fact, according to our latest census, only 30% of Australians actually affiliate to a particular religious grouping. Now, what I mean by that is that 30% of Australians will call themselves Catholics, Muslims, whatever, okay? That means that the remaining, 70% of Australians have no religious affiliation. Now, that doesn't mean they don't have a spiritual belief or a concept of spirituality. It's just they don't turn up to church or mosque or temple once a week, or would claim to be something in that ground. So slightly different in terms of that respect. Our military has a chaplaincy element to it, quite a strong one, and our chaplains within the military are very much ecumenical. So if you're a serving soldier and you happen to have a Protestant background, but a Jewish chaplain or padre is the only one around, then that's fine. That works quite well. And I think the same applies in your circumstance. Where the fundamental difference comes from is that our DVA, our Department of Veterans Administration, does not do anything in terms of spiritual injuries or that sort of injury that might occur to a person on operations that has a basis in spirituality or religion. They don't touch it. And there's a lot of reasons for that, not least of which is that whole idea of government and religion working together. Now, that's changing slowly. And I can talk to that subject in a moment. What I'd also add is that our churches and our religious facilities of various descriptions also don't have a very good understanding of the life of the soldier, and more importantly, at that moment when they translate to veteran. And you'll find that in many cases there is a degree of ignorance within our broader religious community about the whole veteran issue. And I'll give you a few examples of that in a moment. A lot of that is due to the fact that, well, frankly, we haven't had a very big war for quite a while. Like you, Afghanistan, Iraq and bits and pieces around that have been a much bigger area for us. And it was our longest ever war. 14 years we were involved. So we're just, to an extent, starting to come to a grip with the idea of veterans back into our society. So post-Vietnam, but then they're all quite old and in different environments, but we haven't had fresh veterans, and we're starting to get that. So there's some changes coming. Now, where did I get involved in all of this? Some years ago, 10 years ago, I started doing some study in the world of theology. And as I worked through this, I was talking with a very good friend of mine who was, at that stage, the Director General of Chaplaincy for the Australian Army. And I was just talking to him about what I was doing, and he mentioned to me that he'd been in Iraq, and in which I knew that. And he basically had talked about some time that he'd had in Iraq and an experience that happened to him. Now, hopefully the next slide has just come up. Tell the story that one night he was walking around the Australian encampment and walking around the sentry posts, which is in some respects a dumb thing to do because that's how you get yourself shot. But he was a padre, and that's what padres do. And a voice called out to him in the night and said, "Hey, padre, can I ask you a question?" And it was a young soldier who was on sentry duty. So my friend turned to him and said, "Yeah, of course. What can I do for you?" And my friend said, the soldier said to him, "Padre, does God still love me?" My friend was a little bit taken back because that's quite a big question, but it's very typical of a soldier. You know, I've got a question, I'm going to go and ask someone. So this particular soldier asked him that question, "Does God still love me?" And my friend said, "Well, of course he does. Why do you ask?" And he said, "Well, it's just that I had to shoot and kill 2 men yesterday." Now, there's a number of things that come out of that. We can assume that this individual was not committing a war crime, that he was acting within accordance of the rules of engagement and laws of armed conflict. And indeed, had he not fired upon those 2 insurgents, his position, his team, and his friends would have been in danger. So he did the right thing militarily, by morals, by law, and everything else. But for this soldier, for whatever circumstance, he felt that he did the wrong thing by God and that he was unlovable in God's eyes because he'd committed this. So now you've got this sort of conflict, legally, morally, and every other way. Militarily, I did the right thing, but God doesn't love me anymore. How does he know that? It's a feeling, it's a sense, it's a concept. So when that young man, as the case may be, was sitting inside defence, he's fine. There's plenty of chaplains around the place. And whilst going and seeing a chaplain is not compulsory in any sense of the word, they're around. And he obviously realised that, and he reached out to the first chaplain that he could find to ask this question. What my friend posited then was to say, okay, well, what happens when that young man leaves defence and goes into the broader community and returns back to civilian life? In many cases, if you think about the level of religious affiliation within the Australian population, you can probably assume it's the same within the military. So about 30%. It's entirely likely that this fellow's experience with religion and faith in a formal sense probably actually didn't happen until he joined the military. And then all of a sudden there were church parades, and again, not compulsory, but events around him. There were colours, a consecration of regimental flags. If he'd been in the Navy, there would have been a christening of his ship. And there's a whole range of things in that environment. So all of a sudden, for the first time in his life, he's introduced to this whole world of more formalised religion. So this young man now leaves defence, and he's a mister, and he's trotting around society, and it may well be that he's still carrying the baggage of that wound or that influence with him. One of a couple of things might happen. He might turn up to a church of some description because he knew he'd spoken to a chaplain. Wouldn't really know where to go and who to talk to. And if you've never been to a church, it can be a little bit a bit big. So he turns up to a church. I ran this circumstance past another person who was an Anglican chaplain in Melbourne. And I said to her, what would you do if this young man turned up at your door and said, I killed 2 people, I don't know if God still loves me? And she said, oh, well, that's easy. I would make him spend the rest of his life on his knees, begging forgiveness for the heinous sin that he had committed. And I thought, well, that's not actually all that helpful in a lot of respects, but it does demonstrate a degree of ignorance on the behalf of what I would call religious and spiritual practitioners in broader Australian society. It's exemplified by conversations I have with them where they say, oh, well, why do you have to shoot to kill? Can't you just shoot to wound? You know, that thing in the movies where they fire a shot at the guy's hand and he goes, ow, and he drops his gun. And then you have to explain to them that, well, combat's not quite that staged. And soldiers are taught to shoot at the center of the scene mass twice, because you don't want the guy to get back up again and do it to you. The other challenge might be that this fellow, because he's feeling depressed about the fact that his relationship with God is broken, turns up at the local doctor and says, hey, doc, I'm feeling depressed. I had to kill 2 men when I was in Iraq, and I don't think God loves me. Now, with the best will in the world, what might happen is that doctor will hear that statement and he will go, oh, depression. Right, I know what to do with depression. Take the blue pill. By taking the blue pill, that will help you, you'll feel better. Or he might say, go to our DVA equivalent and then get a slot to go and talk to a psychologist or a psychiatrist. Again, they may be right. If you have got such crippling depression that you cannot get out of bed, take the blue pill. If you've got such terrible anxiety that you cannot focus and live within society, by all means, go and see a psychologist. I have to say that because my wife's a psychologist, as is one of my daughters. Okay, so, you know, there's a political announcement there. But the thing is, and here's where it gets a bit difficult, a blue pill's not going to fix a spiritual issue. No matter how much psychological, psychoanalytical counseling you go through, it's not necessarily going to be fixed, because the moment you start talking about God, this becomes a spiritual issue. The words God, Father, Jesus, Allah, whatever context you want to use them in, okay, imply a different thing. And our society and our structures are not ready for this. Now, I've spent some time trolling through and looking at your stuff. You're way advanced on us in this. Your DVA is all over this sort of subject, and there's a lot of material, but we have nothing. So part of what I'm trying to do in my work is to move in that environment and start to think about it. You've seen all of that. I have too many masters. Why is that the case? Don't know. We'll move on. A couple of thoughts before I start talking to you now about this. I want to go through really 4 topics. The first one is moral injury and spirituality. The ruling paradigm when it comes to spiritual issues and trauma is very much seen through the lens of moral injury. And there's a lot to be said for that, but I don't think it's necessarily the best approach. Well, I'll talk about what spiritual health is needed. I'm then going to introduce a new term, spiritual wounds and injuries. So it's the one word or one term here. It's not or, it's and. And then I'll talk to you about a pathway. There's a few limitations. I'm very careful when, and again, possibly within my society, the moment you start talking to soldiers and veterans about religion and faith, they sort of roll their eyes and go, oh, the sky fairy, all right, oh, yeah, magic pixie dust or something like that. And also, I'm very aware that there is a view that sometimes this sort of thing can be seen as evangelizing. And, you know, I think there's a role for evangelizing, but not here. I'm talking about spirituality, not religion. Now, that's an important distinction, all right? A very simple way of defining it is spirituality is the belief in some higher power, entity, or thing. Religion is the way you do it. The way I explain it to people in Australia is to say, you're on a football field and you're wearing an orange jumper because you're an Anglican, or a green jumper because you're a Catholic, or another colour green because you're a Muslim, or purple because you're a Pentecostalist. And you're playing with a round ball, you're playing with a rugby ball, you're playing with a gridiron ball, you're playing with a cricket ball. In any case, you're trying to get across the line, and the line is to live your life. And you'll be playing by the rules of your code, but it's still the same game in that sense. So in my work, there is no value to any particular belief or non-belief, any particular religion. And as I say, it covers Catholics to Calathumpians, Methodists to Muslim. And the last point I'd like to make, and this is a really important point, and this is to an extent, it's only come to me recently. I find a lot of people, when we're talking about this subject, go, oh, there's no such thing as God. And the first thing you've got to do as a psychologist is disabuse the individual of their belief in this mythical creature called God. Okay? God's not real. You know, stop talking about God. The point I keep making back to them is it's not about what you believe. You may not believe in God, or you may believe the answer to God is through Catholicism or Islam or Zoroastrianism or whatever. But that's not your role. Your role is to deal with the wounded person in front of you and deal with the wound however best to suit their needs, and not to try and change their views or change their faith. Okay, so that's enough of a runway to this. Is everybody still with me? Are there any questions? Can you see what's going on the screen? All that sort of stuff. Are we all good to go?
I think we're good, Murray.
Okay, excellent. All right, let's push on then. So next thing, slide come to me. So what's wrong with moral injury? If you have a look at spirituality, trauma, and veterans, anywhere, inevitably, it will come up with moral injury. And of course, there is a tremendous amount written about moral injury. It's really quite interesting when you go onto the web or in any environment and put the terms moral injury in there, how much comes up. It's almost like if I type the word Viagra in there, just how much comes up on that subject. Not that I have a problem, but the point is there is a lot out there in terms of moral injury. And much of the moral injury paradigm, as I refer to it, is actually quite good in terms of this, but there are some limitations that I want to talk about. And the first one is about spirituality and science. Moral injury and the constructs around PTSD and mental health are all very much based within a scientific paradigm. That's very, very sensible. If you think about where moral injury comes from, it comes out of the early 1980s with the work that a number of very clever people did who were medical doctors or psychiatrists in one form or another. So a lot of their work, of course, has a scientific basis to it. Moral injury, then, as it flows from that, has a scientific base to it. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But by the same token, spirituality doesn't really have a measurable scientific base to it. It's the whole how many angels fit on the head of a pin type argument in some respects. So where this becomes a problem is that if you are trying to approach what a spiritual injury might look like from a scientific basis, and the information that you are given is, I have a feeling that God doesn't love me, how do you measure a feeling? Now, there's ways and things around it. How do you turn around and say, well, God told me this? Oh, yeah. When did God tell you this? Which God was this? Was there a burning bush? How did this happen? So there's a whole range of issues in this where, from a scientific perspective, if you look at the way moral injury looks at it, it becomes somewhat of a conflict. And that's where you'll find moral injurists, and some psychologists will say, look, don't worry about the whole God thing. It's not important. You are suffering from a moral injury. Well, again, I go on and argue you are suffering, you may be suffering anyway, an injury in terms of spirituality, because your relationship with the divine, and to me, whatever God or gods or circumstances you think are important is the issue here. I'll call it God because it saves trying to say that all the time. What's happened in a spiritual moral injury is that your relationship with that concept is broken or damaged. So go back to that young soldier I mentioned to you at the beginning. He said, and again, in terms of rules of engagement, in terms of everything else, he did all the right stuff. No questions there. We're not talking about a war crime here. What we're talking about is a circumstance where, although legally, morally, and militarily he did the right thing, he feels that God has said to him, you're wrong, you're bad. Now, that has two aspects to it. He may feel that God has said that to him because of a religious background or a circumstance where, to an extent, Sunday school morality, he was told, thou shalt not kill. And he has killed. Therefore, his understanding of religion as that was taught to him over his life, or indeed was worked through with him with what I would call faith practitioners. Again, a nice general way of saying padre, priest, minister, mullah, rabbi, whatever. So faith practitioner, all right? He may have been told by them over his time. He may have been told by that chaplain I was talking to you about in Melbourne that he committed a heinous sin and must be punished. So on one hand, you have the logical moral construct, a military construct. On the other hand, this amorphous, oblique thing where he has a feeling, one of which that might be a heart-based spirituality issue. So this is a term that's starting to gain a bit of favor, the idea that you have a feeling that's generated from the heart. And hard to prove again, but I think it has some value. Head-based spirituality to me is where I've read this or I've been told this by someone and I understand this on a logical level. Now, it's very, very rare, I would suspect, that any one traumatic circumstance will just be a spiritual thing or just be a moral thing. It's entirely likely that a soldier who has suffered from a blast wound, for example, will have significant physical issues, okay, that have to be dealt with. They may well have moral issues. They may well have PTSD, not surprising. They may also have a spiritual issue to them. So here's a really important thing. That which bleeds, leads. So if your leg is hanging off, fix that first, obviously. That's the one that's got to be done. But if you've got such crippling moral injury, you cannot deal with the fact that your leadership led you into this wrong position. That has to be dealt with. If you feel that God let you down by putting yourself in that circumstance, you deal with that. But no one thing takes over the whole process. And it's part of what some authors are calling a biosocial experience, biosocial spiritual experience. So it's a whole process. So if you can imagine a soldier, and again, it's not just soldiers, sailors, airmen, airwomen, but then I'm ex-army, so I'm going to talk about soldiers, all right? Is lying on a table in a field hospital, and standing around them is a psychologist, a psychiatrist, a surgeon, a general practitioner, and a padre. They're all working together to fix this person. But the surgeon's going to jump in first and sew his leg back on. all right? And the GP is going to give him a shot to make sure that he doesn't get an infection out of it. And maybe then the moral injurist will talk with him. Maybe the padre will talk to him. But all of them will work together. One of the other challenges that I have with the approach that moral injury takes towards this idea of spiritual damage. So someone has passed through a traumatic event, okay? And I'll talk to you about that in a bit more detail shortly. But at the end of that traumatic event, they suffer from a moral injury, a component of which may well be spiritual. That's the approach that tends to run in terms of moral injury. Part of the challenge is that I see when people are talking along that idea is the use of what I would call spiritual tools. Now, spiritual tools in this thing really falls into two categories. It falls into biblical/scriptural experiences and then language. In terms of that sort of scriptural experience and history and the value of that, there's very few aspects of the human existence that is not covered in one spiritual text or another, Christian or otherwise. The challenge is what happens is people tend to cherry pick from it. They will pick a statement. King David said this. King David said that. All right. Allah said this. Allah said that. Or Zoroaster did this. And they will pick one single line out of that and then build an argument around it. But what they don't do, and whilst a full exegesis is not necessary, is they don't actually look at the whole context of that particular line, that particular piece of scripture, that particular circumstance. They just grab the bit that sounds right. And the problem is if anyone's done any work in terms of theology, it's a twisty thing, okay? There's a lot of stuff in the Bible or the Quran or anything else that you can cherry pick out of it and throw forward, and that sounds great. But it can also mean something completely different if you read the line before and after, and you read it in the context of the paragraph and the chapter and the book. The other aspect of spiritual tools that I find moral injury does not do well is the use of terms like soul or God or spirit. What exactly do you mean when you talk about a soul injury? Are you talking, S-O-U-L, I'm talking about here, are you talking about an injury to a spiritual soul that has a divine influence, or you're looking at it from a Greek perspective in terms that is the force of being within the human being? What are you actually talking about in terms of a soul? Because if you're looking at it from a religious perspective, it's a totally different thing. If you're talking about this in terms of some internal concept or construct that goes with mind, body, and soul, but it doesn't have a religious/spiritual dimension to it, then it's a different thing. So in moral injury, and I mean this with great respect, because we're talking about most of the really good authors in the moral industry paradigm, they talk about soul, they'll talk about spirit, they talk about belief in a religious spiritual context, but don't use the right language behind it and don't use the right definitions behind it. So one of the things that's got to happen when you move forward, if you're looking at this concept of spiritual wounds and injuries, is you've got to think about the language you're using. As I mentioned to you before, my wife's a psychologist, and one of the challenges that we see in Australia, I'm sure it's the same there, is a lot of people will say, oh, I've had a difficult experience, I'm suffering from PTSD. Okay, so how do you know you're suffering from PTSD? Oh, it was on Dr. Phil. I saw it on the TV. Someone told me I've got PTSD. As has now been beaten into by my wife and daughter, you don't just get told by Dr. Phil, as wonderful as he is, that you've got PTSD. This needs to be a clinical diagnosis, and it's got to be done properly. Okay, so use of spiritual tools. The other next point I'd like to talk about is that most, if not all, of the moral injury approach to spirituality is that it is an aftermath issue. So if you look at the McGowan, the latest DVA definition of moral injury, it talks about spirituality being an aftermath of an event. The idea being that you as an individual pass through a traumatic event and a number of things happen to you, and in the aftermath, you may lose your sense of spirituality and your belief in a higher power or a God. I'm a bit of a fan of the alpha and omega argument. that for many people, spirituality is a before, during, and after event, and that an event might actually not have a moral injury, but might have a spiritual component to it. So two individuals could attend or be involved in exactly the same event, one of whom will find it as a spiritual injury, the other one might find it as a moral injury. So to suggest it is purely an aftermath, I think is wrong, because there is a predisposition that some people may well have towards issues of spirituality. Go back to my young soldier, for example, and what he does is maybe somewhere in his background, he was predisposed to believe that killing was something that God would hate him for, and therefore he was unworthy. So the idea of moral injury suggesting a spiritual injury as an aftermath issue is too shallow. It's more than that. The other thing that comes out of all of this, and this is where I've got to be careful, I'm not suggesting that dealing with a spiritual injury or a spiritual wound and injury is an opportunity for evangelism. I mean, yes, I suppose if you want to look at it that way, it is. It's not just recovery and resilience. Okay, so the idea of spiritual growth, that an individual, I have a scar on my hand. The scar on that scar, that little bit of skin where the scar is tougher than the rest of the skin around it. Okay, so that has grown and become stronger. Arguably, a circumstance is that leads you through to the point may well, in fact, a spiritual wound and injury may well lead to a period of growth, may well lead to a period of spiritual revival, may well lead to a moving forward. What I'd say here is that we've got to be real careful, because if you think about this, our DVA, your DVA, our military, if an individual is wounded on operations in a military circumstance, we have a contract, social, written or otherwise, to repair that individual. So if they get shot in the leg, we fix that leg, all right? If they suffer PTSD, we fix that PTSD, all right? If they lose or have a break in their faith with God, then we need to deal with that too. But we do not need to then make them into a better Catholic or a better anything else. The idea is that we need to bring them back to where they're going. So spiritual growth, not just recovery and resilience, but to an extent, recovery and resilience is important. Okay, so everyone with me still? Okay. So what do we need to do? Well, whatever we think about in terms of how we deal with a person whose spiritual health, and in particular a veteran whose spiritual health has been compromised, we need to think about a few aspects to it. I think our approach to spiritual care for someone who's suffered an effect on their spiritual health has to have a dual nature. There has to be wounds that looked at. Wounds, in my context, are something deep and deeply personal. And this is this difficult issue of a heart-based spirituality, where I perceive, and this is about perception, I perceive that I have done the wrong thing to God, and therefore I am punished. I perceive God has done the wrong thing to me. Now, I'll give you an example of this. There was an Australian Army Lieutenant Colonel who was on operations in East Timor in 2002. And he returned to the barracks one afternoon from being out and accidentally fired his personal weapon, what we call a negligent discharge here, a career-killing activity. And it was very much a case where, because he'd done this, his career was over, end of discussion. After he did this, he, to his credit, made sure that everyone was safe, secured the scene, no one was hurt and all that sort of stuff. Then went back to his room and fell on his knees and literally wept and screamed, "Why, God, did you let me be so stupid as to do this?" So the idea is that he is blaming God for not stopping him do this. In other words, he was stupid, but it was God's fault that he was stupid. So that I would consider is a spiritual wound which has a personal nature to it. Anyone can say, well, how do you know that? Why do you think that happened? Because I feel that. That is my perception of it. Spiritual injury, again, as I indicated, may well be more dogma, doctrine related. Thou shalt not. And it's not just as simple as that, but there's a whole range of things where individuals who are in that role of spiritual care and will have a tremendous influence on people. And they may well not necessarily use that influence. Yes. I'm going to talk in a moment about a thing called a thin place event. From the moral injury world, I think we're all fairly familiar with the concept of MIEs, a morally injurious event, or a PMIE. And that's great, and it talks about an event that creates a moral problem for you. Well, I think there's a spiritual dimension to that too, and I call it a thin place event. Any of you with any background in Celtic theology will know that they talk about thin places as being a physical location on the earth where the veil between the spiritual world and the physical world is quite thin. These are intensely spiritual places. You often find monasteries and places like that are built on them. Places like Jerusalem, for argument's sake, are a thin place because of that, as is Mecca, as is any of that. Well, a thin place event can occur at the same time and in the same place as a moral injury event. Back in Rwanda in 1996, there was a significant massacre, well, a lot of massacres that occurred, but one of the massacres, an Australian Army medical detachment of about 10 people got caught in the middle of that massacre. And they were literally bunkered down in the middle of this. And they were ordered not to fire back. The idea being that the situation was so confusing, so dramatic, that had they started firing, more people would have been killed. There's a moral dimension to that because the commanding officer who told them not to do that made what was tactically probably the right solution. But that doesn't mean that the people there didn't feel that they were morally injured because that person didn't do that. There was also a spiritual dimension to it because this happened in the grounds of a cathedral. And a lot of them said, God, why did you let this happen in your space? So not just it happened, but it actually happened on your turf. That's a TPE, all right? So it's like a moral injury event, but this is a spiritual injury event. Mystery. There's no getting around it. God is mysterious. The whole God thing is awkward. It's not clear. As I've said to a number of people on a number of occasions, gee, it'd be handy if I could get a burning bush, or someone could, speak to me on the road to Damascus in thunder and lightning. It'd be really handy. But God doesn't necessarily work that way. There is a degree of mystery to it which is undefined. I'm sorry, there's no way of defining. It's based on your perception of God and how God speaks with you. So what needs to be done in spiritual injury is to think about how do we now describe this? Part of that, theology and the language, and part of that is about understanding how we use words and terms to do it. Now, that doesn't mean that by saying it's mysterious, it's fluffy. Okay, I'm not suggesting that this is not a process where we cannot expand and understand. I'm just simply saying you have to accept there is an element that you can't explain within it. Go back to my point where some people say, oh, therefore God's not real. Why are you believing in God? Don't believe in God. No. Park that. Okay, just park that. What you need to do is now talk about the whole idea of how this fits together. So that brings us to spiritual wounds and injuries. And here's a definition. We're going to have a talk about this in bits. So just, if you could, take a moment and have a quick read of that. This is my current definition of it. Definitions, as we all know, change on a daily basis, and depending how much study I do. I'm at chapter 8 of 10 chapters, and this is the definition. By the time I get to chapter 10 of 10 chapters, who knows what it'll be, but I think it's pretty all right. There's a couple of aspects to it I'd like you to pay attention to or note in particular. The first one is about this idea of perceptions of God, either through a direct engagement, i.e. God speaks to me, or a facilitated thing through a faith community. All right. So in other words, the Padre said to me, this is what it meant. I read the Quran and it said, this is what it meant. In the Bhagavad Gita, it says this. Okay. So this is an idea that one aspect of it has a facilitated thing. The and is important because I don't think these things exist in separation. The second aspect to it is that they feel that I have either failed God or that God has failed them. Why, God, did you let me be so stupid as to make this mistake? God does not love me because I did the wrong thing. So there's two of those. There's two different aspects to it. The important point here, and this is the culminating point to this definition, the fact that an individual has lost faith in God, or whose faith in some form of spirituality has been influenced in some way, is not the spiritual wound and injury. It is the effect that that loss of faith has on the individual's mental health and overall well-being, and how that effect then presents in behaviors like substance abuse or depression or anger. So the fact that that lieutenant colonel who had the issue blamed God for his stupidity, so the shooting, the accidental shooting, was a TPE. The fact that that happened, he blamed God for that. The fact that he then felt anger towards God, and as I understand, subsequently went through a long period of self-abuse and depression and anger over this issue, is where the spiritual injury lies. So guilt, substance abuse, and anger, of course, exist in the moral and mental health space, but it's the origins of it that are important. If the origin of that anger lies in a spiritual issue, it has a spiritual basis that needs to be looked at. A lot of common aspects between the two, there's no doubt about it. The treatment and management of one is the same. If I was forced to make a definition between, or a distinction between the two, I use a syllogism to describe it. Moral injury is to reason, as spiritual wounds and injuries are to belief. So in a moral injury, you believe something because you've been told that, it's been codified, it's a law, it's a moral, it's something that you have with your relationship with a society, society's rules and morals. In a spiritual injury, it's a one-to-one thing. Now, it may well be facilitated through another person, but it's you and your concept of what God is. A little confusing diagram for you. I like pictures, and that's how I think it all plays out. And I can provide details to this. I'm just conscious of time, so we might just jump to this one. If you have a look at the components to it, there is a spiritual disposition. No one comes to anything without a spiritual or a moral disposition. No one starts with a clean slate. And the spiritual disposition may well be your background, your history, and your training. I talk about a thin place event instead of a moral injurious event. And that's important because the two can exist at the same time, all right? Or they can exist separately. And two individuals can be in a space. And I can give you an example of that myself. When I was in the army in East Timor, we were involved in doing an investigation into a shooting of a potential insurgent. Somewhat awkwardly, the insurgent, when their body was recovered, was not in uniform, did not have a weapon. So it looked a little bit like a war crime. We unpacked the whole process, and it became clear what the circumstances were. But there were three people that day who were involved in this. There was myself, there was an army lawyer, and an army military policeman. Now, I'm pretty sure this army military policeman was about 8 foot tall, and he was built like, he was huge. I'm pretty sure his existence in that group was to protect the lieutenant colonel who was there, which was me. And I was rather happy he was there for that. We were in a very dodgy situation, and it was not a pleasant place. So very, very happy to hide behind him. 5 years after that event, I got a phone call from a military investigation board to say that that warrant officer had committed suicide. And when he committed suicide, the part of the reason for doing that was what he witnessed that day. Now, all three of us were there on that day. We all saw, smelt, felt the same things. Yet one of us was affected in a fairly dramatic way. Why were the other two not? So that's about perceptions. It's about predisposition. It's about a whole range of things. Now, it forms as an act. You commit something, you don't do something, or you feel betrayed. And the actor in this circumstance is yourself, obviously. It's God, or it's that commanding officer at Caballo who said, no, don't fire back. you've got to, and this is important, there's got to be a degree of acceptance that something happened. So go back to my East Timor experience. For me, it wasn't an issue, so I didn't feel anything, okay? But for others, it was. Now, the results, this is where you've got the squiggly lines, because you cross a spiritual line, which is not real clear, okay? And you suffer what I call a spiritual wound or injury. Remember, it's the same thing. Some hallmark behaviors and treatments, more actors, and then we go to the results. So I've written some stuff on this, and we can talk about it later if anyone's interested. Almost there. I talk about this thing called the spiritual arc, and I said to you the idea that an individual actually can improve as a result of this. There's a growing arc, there's a degrading arc, and each point along that arc is measured by a thin place event. So one example of thin place event is the soldier who shoots the individuals. Does God still love me? In his case, that led to a degrading arc. In the case of example 2, why God did you let me do this? Again, a degrading arc, but at some point that individual got some form of management or intervention and became stronger in his faith. So this is not a fixed process. You can go up or down. You can get better or not better. Perhaps I'm very conscious of time, and I don't want to waste too much of your time talking about this. It's obviously a big subject, and there's a lot can be covered more. And there's 100,000 words, a big subject that I'm writing at the moment. There's a few points I'd like to finish on. Moral injury and spirituality. What's wrong? Moral injury is not wrong. I'm not suggesting that there's not a spiritual dimension to moral injury. I'm not suggesting that it is wrong. What I'm saying is that the moral injury approach to spirituality is too shallow. What it does not do is provide sufficient depth in subjects such as theology, language, examples. It doesn't take into account concepts of mystery, of heart and head spirituality. Yes, you can't. How do you measure a feeling? You say God spoke to you? Oh yeah, when was that? All right. How do you measure that? But nevertheless, that is a factor. What do we need to do to talk about this in a different way? I think we need to step away from moral injury and start talking about, well, spiritual wounds and injuries and the spiritual damage that needs to be repaired. More theology, more data, more practical analysis of it. Again, I would say to you in the Australian context, we have very little in this space. There's a lot of stuff written in the US, possibly the nature of people in Australia, possibly our experience, but we don't really write a lot about this, and we need to start doing that. So for me, the next thing when I finish this PhD, will be to do some work in terms of looking at how we measure this and how much is there. Spiritual wounds and injuries, as defined, is evolving, no doubt about it, but it is spiritual wounds and injuries, spiritual injuries, all right? So it's not just one aspect, it's both. In the same way that if you encounter a blast issue, a roadside bomb, it's not just going to be physical wounds. There's going to be some mental wounds. There's going to be some personal wounds about why it is I was in that place at that point. There'll be a bunch of things. And finally, the SW&I pathway talks about an individual journey. It's not going to be the same for everyone, obviously. The spiritual arc that a person goes through is going to be different. But what it does is it provides some signposting. And for practitioners and people who are trying to work with veterans in this space, it's not a bad way of saying, when that young veteran is sitting behind you and says, does God still love me? Where are they on their pathway and where are they on their arc? And at some point, as a spiritual practitioner, I might need to intervene. But you know what? I might also need to say, listen, son, that's a really big problem. Let me refer you to a psychologist. And I'll write a letter of referral to do that. Or what I think I'm hearing is a medical problem. Let me send you to a general practitioner. So by the same token, in return, I would love to think we get to a point where a general practitioner or a psychologist looks at this and goes, you said God. Hang on, that's not my field, okay? So hopefully my wife one day will turn around and say, yeah, Murray, this is yours, go, all right? Well, okay. Well, folks, I think that's about it. There's a couple of things. There's a whole bunch of further reading there. If you're finding it difficult to sleep at night and want something to make you feel a bit relaxed and doze off, please feel free to read any of the things that I've got there. I work it through, and there's a couple of others that are about to come out. I've done a spiritual analysis of Saint Longinus. And for those of you who are unaware, Saint Longinus was the centurion at Christ's crucifixion who put the spear into his side, and in later life became a bishop. He's a very good example of a veteran suffering a spiritual wound. So that will come out shortly. And there's a bunch of other stuff there. If you're bored, please read. There's my details. If you want to catch up with me at any stage, happy to talk. As people now know, never ask me about my PhD because you won't get off the phone quickly. That's about it. Thank you for your time today. I do appreciate it. I hope the rest of this colloquium goes well. I hope to see you all in one form or another next year in North Carolina, I think it is. And other than that, back to you, Corinne. Thank you.
Thank you, Murray. Wow, that was amazing. Who has questions? Feel free to either unmute yourselves if you are on screen or in person, or if your mics are a little bit difficult to get to, feel free to type things into the chat, and I'm happy to read them aloud for Murray.
I'm not quite sure how to start.
Oh dear, that sounds ominous.
Yes, this intersect between spirituality and psychology has been an interest for me in terms of veteran. It's been an interest for me for a long time. And so my first question, and then I'm going to just say some things, but did you define the difference between a wound and an injury?
Okay. Look, like most things, it is slightly arbitrary. What I did was I looked at the Australian Defence definition of a wound and an injury, and based it, the wound tends to, as we defined it, have a longer term and deeper implication to it. An injury tends to be a slightly shorter term and more transactional injury. So a wound is transformational. It is, you've lost a leg, you're suffering intense PTSD, you've got a major illness of some description. An injury tends to be, you've got a broken leg, let's fix the broken leg. So terribly simplistic, of course, but I then took that basis, and that comes from our defense health concept, and then took that basis to say a spiritual wound is something that happens that requires a much deeper diagnosis, a much deeper understanding, and it has a much longer term implication. Does not mean it is more intense. A broken leg can be incredibly intense, all right? But by the same token, the spiritual injury, where it is something that is dogma or doctrine based, is slightly easier, because if it is, well, commandment number 6 says thou shalt not kill, there's a whole wealth. There's 2,000 years worth of arguments about that, and about just war theory, and about lawful killing, and the difference between murder and all. So that, there's that argument there. You can fix that. So that's my kind of understanding. Is it slightly arbitrary? Of course it is, but it's a place to start.
Okay, that's good. So is it okay for me to just talk a little bit?
Sure.
All right, so I started doing arts and military related projects around 2009. I've done all kinds of things, and I manage an art collection of artwork made by veterans, made from military uniforms that have been shredded and turned into artwork. And so that therapeutic aspect of, addressing through art practices has been something I've been interested in for a long time. I also am a Quaker, and I attend a conference. I've been attending a conference for a very long time, Friends Conference on Religion and Psychology. And that intersect between the, the spiritual aspects of how we deal with our lives, and then the psychological aspects of also how we deal with our lives, has been actively a part of what I'm interested in, with the work that I have done on veterans. And in terms of the arts part, what I've done is research on how the military has used different forms of arts for rehabilitation and vocational training and soldier well-being, and how that kind of work has helped veterans kind of move along in their life. The moving in of spiritual aspects, it's like another layering in, and the psychological is another layering in. Am I making sense?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, one of the things is to suggest is that there is any one approach that will work to healing veterans, is to say there's only one injury. If every veteran went to war and got shot in the leg, then that'd be simple. But it doesn't work that way. Things resonate on different levels. And to my mind, it's the layering of that that's the issue. A little bit of this, a little bit of this, a little bit of this. In the same way that a doctor, when they prescribe a repair for an injury, they may well have a number of components to it. It's the same thing. And for some people that resonates closely. It also gives them a place to focus. There's quite a school of thought that talks about religion and art, for example. So I think that's perfectly sensible, and it's a very good thing. The important thing is that people are thinking about this. If I think back to the environment I grew up in the 1980s in the Australian military, the last thing on earth you would ever do to someone is to say, I've got a mental health issue, because that would be a very quick exit from the military. And likewise, even if you suggested that you had some sort of depression or guilt issue, I believe you get some sort of response to that, which would be, oh, suck it up, princess. It's not that big a deal. Just toughen up. All right, good point. Go for a run, son. You'll be all right. Have a talk to the chaplain afterwards. Thankfully, we've moved past that. I'm still very much of that ilk. It's hard to lose, but we've moved past that. So the suck it up and go for a run, you'll feel better afterwards thing may well be part of it, but it may well be art. It may well be, and when you're running, go past a church. And it may well be run hard so that you can build your physical strength. There is no one answer to this. That's the point. Horses, courses.
Yes. Yep. I'll give somebody else a chance to ask something.
So Murray, I appreciate very much sort of the tender care with which you attend to perception as really fundamental to the experience itself, but also the interpretation of that experience, which then seems to sort of catalyze everything else from that perspective. I wonder if at all how you might, or how emotional response, right, as sort of a combination of perception and also physiology might play into, if at all, this sort of complex interweaving of spiritual injury and wounds. Thinking about sort of, if perception is one sliver and spirituality is another, is emotional also in there? And if so, have you thought about what that looks like in your model?
An interesting aspect to it. I mean, I think I talk about the idea that your predisposition and perception is influenced by a number of things. It's by your education, it's by your training, by your military culture as well. All military organizations have a particular culture to them, and there's a tremendous amount of similarity between them. There really is, which will shape the way you focus on things and how you do it. So your emotional intelligence is also another aspect, your ability to recognize your own emotions and where they fit together. I think in the model, I talk about the idea of acceptance. So 3 individuals saw the same thing. One of us actually accepted the event and accepted some aspect of it in their lives, and emotionally, spiritually, socially, there were a whole range of issues. It was like to say that he committed suicide because of what he saw that day would be wrong. He had had a career before that. He'd had a life before that. He'd had a career and a life after that. Who knows what was happening in terms of his emotional perspective of everything. So, yeah, it's not black and white. That's the point. There is no one thing that you can point to. And I like the analogy, I must admit, of a soldier on a stretcher in a tent, and standing around that soldier are a group of practitioners, all of whom are looking at that soldier's injuries from their particular perspective and making a diagnosis. And then the conversation that goes on between all of them is to say, what have we got here? And the surgeon steps in and says, he's bleeding to death, I'm on. Okay, all right, I'm done now. You need to go and give him a shot. And the GP steps away. And then the soldier, as he recovers, said, I don't know if God loves me anymore. At which point the padre steps up. All right. So this is this thing, but then maybe the padre leads first. Maybe what happens is the soldier wakes up and goes, God does not love me. And the surgeon goes, I'm out of here. All right. But comes back later on when he goes, oh, by the way, are you aware you've got a bullet in your back? Okay. So layering, I think that's the point. To suggest any one thing is a cause or a condition or a circumstance is narrow-minded at the best.
Or a treatment for that matter, right? The approach for how we move forward to healing, right?
Absolutely. And I think the idea of art therapy is excellent. I think physical therapy, horse riding, pottery, just going and sitting by the beach, if that works for you too. But the point is, so long as it's guided, and what we're not doing, and what worries me in our context, is that we don't have anyone who's looking after this. And we're starting to think about it. But one of the things we as a nation have to think about is that the veterans from the First World War or from the Second World War lived into their 40s, 50s, and 60s. Some are still around, obviously, well, not World War I veterans. The veteran who leaves defence today at 21 will live to 110. So he or she will be on the books for a lot longer. Okay, and as their life changes and moves, things will go up and down in terms of where they're going. Things that aren't important now, when they're 50 or 60 or something like that, will suddenly become important. So this is where we need to start looking at the throughput. And this is not just the Department of Veteran Affairs. A quick run across all of the major websites in Australia, all the major groupings, and no one is doing anything about this. We've got lots of policies about refugees and gays and homeless and, all of which are obviously terribly important. But what are we doing for the veterans? And I'm not suggesting this is a great evangelistic movement of the 21st century, but in some respects, I've got to tell you, if I'm sitting in a church somewhere, I'm thinking there is a population of 864,000 Australian veterans, a lot more in your case, out there. Who's looking after them? Now, not all of them are going to want your help, but some will. So what happens when that veteran knocks on your church door? How do you greet them? Get on your knees? Or why did you have to kill him? Or come in, here's a plan.
It sounds to me, Murray, like you're advocating for, sort of better education and awareness, not just for spiritual practitioners, but also for medical and mental health providers, right? That there's no one that's doing a great job overall. And so there's a great deal of education and training to go around to all of the various sectors where veterans may be more likely to connect themselves either organically or through referrals.
Oh, look, you're absolutely right. It's as simple as it sounds. The guys wearing white are in the Navy. The guys in green are in the Army. The guys in blue are in the Air Force. That sounds silly, but it's not really. The way that Army approaches a problem is this. Army thinks this way. The way that Navy approaches a problem goes this way. The way that Air Forces approaches a problem, who the hell knows what they think? All right. So it really is a case of understanding that sort of thing. It's even as simple as saying something like, a veteran comes to you and says, I want to see you, and I'll meet you at 2 o'clock this afternoon. Okay. And you, as a faith practitioner or a doctor or whatever, say, yep, no worries, 2 o'clock. You don't turn up until 2:10. The veteran automatically is going to be uncomfortable because you're late. Okay. You're late. Now, the veteran will go, oh, you're a civilian, it's all right. But already they're uncomfortable. It's a silly thing like saying the practitioner turns up and they look scruffy. They're dirty. They've got multiple earrings. They've got hair all over the place. The veteran's not stupid. They'll go, yes, of course, they're allowed to do it. But straight away, there's that barrier that gets built. So I'm not suggesting that earrings and scruffy hair are the issue here. Far from it. What I'm saying is you as an individual practitioner who are going to help this person need to understand the patient you're dealing with. Now, from a spiritual, religious, faith practitioner point of view, that means you're going to have to probably get a bit sharper in terms of your practice. You're going to need to write a few reports. You're going to need to say, right, this is how I understand it. You might find yourself writing a referral as a minister to a doctor. How weird is that? You might find a doctor writing a referral. Dear Pastor Smith, thank you for seeing patient John Smith. He is a 35-year-old ex-army veteran who's saying he got. So all of a sudden, a faith practitioner, a minister, gets something like that, which between doctors is entirely usual. But he now goes, oh, what do I do with this? So even down to the point of going, I'll have to save this in a file somewhere. All right, because now this becomes, so it goes on and on and on from there. It also goes within our broader community and society that in Australia, where faith and politics and government are just miles and poles apart. All right. And again, a lot of the arguments I tend to have with people is, well, in a Western liberal democracy, we don't encourage or support religion. You know, that's not the way we work. Again, my argument really is quite simple. From a government perspective, you broke it, you fix it. Okay? Really, what it comes down to. If I've got a broken leg because of my service in the military, guess what? You fix it. If I've got PTSD because of my service in the military, fix it. If I don't believe in God anymore and my faith has been challenged, harder, no doubt about it, but you've got to do something to restore that to the point where you bring that person back to the condition they were in before the event. You don't make them faster, smarter, stronger, more faithful, turn them into priests. No. And you don't necessarily say, right, the answer to this is Catholicism or Methodist or Islam. No, you bring them back to the point where if that individual then chooses after their leg is better to become a marathon runner, that's fine. If that individual chooses after their PTSD to become a psychologist, great. And likewise, if that person thinks, well, now my faith's restored, I want to go here, also great. That's not part of the equation. Okay. So government, you broke it, you fix it.
So in terms of, you broke it, you fix it, and restoring a sense of religious connection or whatever, spiritual connection. Where does theology fit into this? I don't know that you can take someone back to what they were before it's like maybe taking them somewhere else, because you gain an understanding of the theological foundation that they came out of, and help them get to another place with, to me, that would be more under spiritual growth.
Oh, and you're absolutely right. The treatment regime that follows, to my understanding, the way I'm looking at this, the work I'm doing will never be to say this is how you treat these people, because this is where the practitioners of various faiths and circumstances come in, no doubt about it. My view and approach is to understand where they are and how they got to this particular perspective. How you then treat them in terms of theology, maybe the what I would say is, if you've got a heart-based approach to your spirituality, then that's about spiritual counseling. That's more closely linked to the idea of a counselor sitting down and talking with you and exploring issues of faith. If you've got a more head-based approach to it, it's wrong to kill. That's where you go, well, hang on, have you heard about just war? Go and read this and understand this context and understand that. Read this, hear this, talk about this. So that's where you've got a faith leader of some description taking them through a more doctrinaire, dogma type process, as opposed to a faith, and it's probably the same guy or girl, that's it. But you've got another faith leader who's taking them through a more counseling based approach. But you don't know which of those two approaches until you've done this bit at the beginning to find out. And if anyone thinks, right, I'm going to jump in and say, become a Roman Catholic and all will be well, or take the blue pill and all will be wrong, both are wrong. And whether you choose to be a Roman Catholic or an Anglican or a Calithumpian is not really my issue here in terms of this, or whether indeed you just don't want to put a label to it and say, I believe in God, or I believe in nature as being my guiding spirit, or art being my guiding spirit. I don't care. I literally don't care, because if we go down the Catholicism is right argument and we cross the left rather than the right, then you go down to a whole lot of frippery that frankly is not necessary. It's important in that faith, but you just don't need to do it here. The focus is the guy or the girl on the stretcher on the table. That's what you've got to do. And you've got to get them up and you've got to get them moving. And you've got to return them to battle worthy. And battle worthy means that they can go back into the physical battle, or they can go back into the battle of life. Okay? It doesn't mean that you make them stronger, better, faster, fitter, whatever. You restore them. And that is the contract we have as nations with the people who have volunteered to go and do this. Okay? Now, the same way that a gunshot injury to the leg, you will probably never be completely better, but you've got to get as close as you can. All right.
Thank you, Murray. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. This was really wonderful. I appreciate everyone's time here. And for those of you who will come back and watch this later, I hope you enjoyed it as much as we have. I would be remiss if I didn't remind folks that our next colloquium is going to be scheduled for November 10th. So be on the lookout for additional information about our speaker. And again, just as Jim said too, the Veterans in Society 2024 conference coming March 14th and 15th at the University of South Carolina in Columbia. We hope to see many of you there. We hope to hear from many of you and make more friends and partners under this giant umbrella of Veteran Studies. And if you haven't, of course, already joined the Veteran Studies Association, you can check out more at veteranology.org. Murray, thank you so much. Good luck on finishing what is sure to be a fantastic dissertation. We will send you all of our energy and positive vibes.
Thank you. I'll have all of that. Thank you and more. Much appreciated.
Thank you so much.
Have a good evening, folks.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a good one, everybody.